Imagine a world where every single thing you take for granted, your morning commute, the clothes on your back, the hospitals that save lives, the internet running through cables buried beneath your feet, none of it exists. Not delayed, not different, gone. Now imagine one man standing in a fog-soaked Scottish workshop in 1765, staring at a broken machine, a machine everyone else had already given up on, and deciding, for reasons that defy rational explanation, to fix it. What he built that day didn't just change transportation or industry or economics, it rewired the human species. It launched an era so transformative that historians call it the hinge point of civilization. The moment humanity went from a world powered by muscle and wind to one powered by fire, iron, and steam. But here's the part they don't teach you in school. That same invention, the one that lifted hundreds of millions of people out of poverty, that built cities from muddy riverbanks, that stitched continents together, also filled children's lungs with black dust. It poisoned rivers. It rewired the atmosphere in ways we are still paying for today, 2 centuries later. This is the story of the steam engine and the age of coal, the invention that gave the modern world everything, and the price it charged to do so. Stay with me, because by the end of this video, you'll never look at a power outlet, a train window, or a clear blue sky the same way again. To understand where James Watt came in, you need to understand where the world was before him, and the world was exhausted. In the early 1700s, Britain was running out of something it had always taken for granted: wood. Forests that had stood for thousands of years had been stripped to build ships, heat homes, and smelt iron. The empire was consuming itself. The solution, everyone agreed, was coal. Britain had it in absurd abundance, massive black seams running deep beneath the ground across Wales, Yorkshire, and Northumberland. The problem? Getting to it. As miners dug deeper, water flooded the shafts. Men worked ankle-deep, waist-deep, sometimes neck-deep in freezing black water. It was brutal, dangerous, and slow. Enter Thomas Newcomen. In 1712, Newcomen, a blacksmith and Baptist preacher from Devon of all people, built the world's first practical steam engine. It was enormous, it was inefficient, it was ugly, but it pumped water, and that was enough to make it revolutionary. Newcomen's engine worked by boiling water to create steam, then injecting cold water to condense it, creating a vacuum that pushed a piston down. Simple, crude, brutally effective. For 50 years, Newcomen engines pumped water out of mines across Britain, hundreds of them, chugging away day and night, guzzling coal to mine more coal. The circular logic of an industrial civilization bootstrapping itself into existence. But they were expensive to run. Some collieries spent more on fuel for their pump than they made from the coal they extracted. Then, in 1763, a broken Newcomen model arrived on the desk of a 27-year-old instrument maker at the University of Glasgow. His name was James Watt, and he had a habit that would prove fateful. He couldn't look at something broken without wanting to understand why it was broken. What he discovered was almost embarrassingly simple in hindsight, but that's the nature of genius. It finds the obvious thing everyone else walked past. The Newcomen engine wasted most of its energy doing something pointless, heating and cooling the same cylinder over and over in every stroke. It was like filling a bathtub with hot water, draining it, then doing it again 1,000 times a day. Watt's idea: use a separate condenser. Keep the main cylinder hot, move the condensation elsewhere. Stop wasting energy fighting yourself. It sounds simple. It was simple conceptually, but executing it nearly broke him. Watt spent the next decade in a cycle of breakthrough and bankruptcy. He partnered with a manufacturer named John Roebuck, who went bust. He survived on surveying work, mapping Scottish canals while his ideas gathered dust. Then, in 1775, he found Matthew Boulton. Boulton was everything Watt wasn't: a showman,
a salesman, a manufacturer with a vision that matched Watt's ambition but was expressed entirely differently. Where Watt saw problems to solve, Boulton saw fortunes to make. "I sell here, sir," Boulton famously told King George III during a tour of his factory, "what all the world desires to have: power." Boulton and Watt became one of history's great partnerships. By 1781, they had solved the next critical problem. Newcomen engines went up and down, useful for pumping, useless for almost everything else. Watt invented the sun and planet gear to convert that reciprocal motion into rotational motion. Suddenly, the steam engine could turn a wheel, and once you can turn a wheel, you can turn anything.
What happened next is almost impossible to fully comprehend. Between 1780 and 1850, the world didn't just change, it accelerated. For all of human history up to that point, economic growth had averaged less than 0.5% per year. Empires rose and fell, technology crept forward, but the pace of daily life, of production, of human capability, it was measured in generations. Then the steam engine hit, and history started moving at a different speed. Textile mills, which had run on water wheels and were therefore chained to rivers, broke free. They could be built anywhere. Manchester, a town of 25,000 people in 1772, swelled to over 300,000 by 1850. Out of nowhere, out of steam. Iron production exploded. In 1788, Britain produced around 68,000 tons of iron. By 1839, it was producing over 1.3 million tons. The same steam engines that pumped the mines were now driving the bellows that smelted the ore, forging the very machines that would replace them. But nothing exemplified the age of steam quite like the railway. In 1825, George Stephenson opened the Stockton and Darlington Railway, the world's first public steam-powered rail line. His locomotive, the Locomotion, hauled 80 tons of coal at the blistering speed of 15 miles per hour. People watching it reportedly wept. Not from sadness, from sheer incomprehension. A machine, moving faster than a horse, pulling what would have taken 100 carts. By 1850, Britain had over 6,000 miles of railway track. By 1900, the world had over 466,000 miles of railway, enough to wrap the Earth more than 18 times. Goods that once took weeks to travel across a country moved in hours. Food reached cities fresh. Letters that arrived in weeks arrived in days. The concept of far away began to dissolve. Steam-powered ships crossed the Atlantic in under 2 weeks, a journey that had previously taken anywhere from 4 to 8 weeks, depending on the wind's mood. The world compressed. For the first time in history, humans could move faster than a horse. And it all ran on coal. Here's where history tends to look away. Because what powered this miracle was not just engineering genius, it was human suffering on a scale that is genuinely difficult to reckon with. Coal did not mine itself, and in the 19th century, coal was mined by hand, by men, women, and children working in conditions so dark, so cramped, and so dangerous that modern safety inspectors would have shut every single one of them down before breakfast. Children as young as 5 years old worked in British coal mines in the early 1800s, not as observers, as workers. Called trappers, they sat alone in pitch-black tunnels for up to 14 hours a day, opening and closing ventilation doors to let coal carts pass, for a penny a day. Older children, called hurriers, dragged coal carts through tunnels too low for adults, on hands and knees, for miles, every day. The 1842 Mines Act eventually banned women and children under 10 from working underground. Children under 10. The bar was that low. But even for adult miners, the mine was a slow execution. Black lung disease, pneumoconiosis, caused by decades of breathing coal dust, was so common it was simply accepted as the miner's fate, a natural consequence of the work. Men who survived the cave-ins, the explosions, the floods, and there were hundreds of those,
often died slowly in their 40s and 50s, unable to breathe, lungs turned to stone. Above ground, it wasn't much better. The cities that steam built were also, in a very literal sense, cities of poison. London's Great Smog of 1952, by which point coal had been burning in that city for nearly 200 years, killed an estimated 12,000 people in 5 days. The smog was so thick that the blind were reportedly hired to lead the sighted through the streets. Cinema projectors couldn't cut through it indoors. Cattle at Smithfield markets suffocated in their pens. And 1952 wasn't an anomaly, it was a culmination. Throughout the 19th century, industrial cities ran constant, chronic versions of that disaster. Life expectancy in Manchester in the 1940s was just 28 years for the working class, not because of war or famine, because of air that was, in a meaningful clinical sense, toxic. Charles Dickens didn't make up the fog in his novels. He was describing the weather.
History rarely gives us clean heroes and villains. The steam engine and the coal age are a masterclass in that ambiguity. On the credit side, the Industrial Revolution lifted human life expectancy from roughly 35 to 40 years globally at the start of the 19th century to over 70 years by the end of the 20th. Not entirely because of steam, medicine matters, sanitation matters, but the wealth generated by industrial production funded every single advance that followed. The food supply was transformed. Steam-powered farming machinery, threshers, plows, irrigation pumps allowed smaller numbers of people to feed larger populations. Famines that had periodically wiped out tens of thousands became rarer, then rarer still in the industrialized world. The abolition of slavery, while driven by moral and political forces, was also materially enabled by the steam engine. Historians debate the degree, but the economic argument for enslaved labor weakened as machines that could do the same work for cheaper became available. The engine didn't end slavery, human courage did, but it changed the economic calculus. Global literacy rates climbed, driven by the economics of steam-powered printing presses that made books and newspapers affordable for the first time in history. Information, which had been the privilege of the wealthy, became a commodity. On the debit side, the ecological damage was and is staggering. The coal age began pumping carbon dioxide into the atmosphere at a scale the planet had never experienced in human history. By the time the scientific community began measuring atmospheric CO2 in the late 1950s, it was already at 315 parts per million, a level not seen for at least 800,000 years. The carbon emitted by coal doesn't disappear, it doesn't degrade, it accumulates. The CO2 released by a Victorian factory in 1860 is, in a very real physical sense, still in the atmosphere today. Every generation since has inherited that debt, compounding. Rivers across Britain, Europe, and the industrializing United States became open sewers of industrial runoff. The Thames ran black. The Cuyahoga River in Ohio, loaded with industrial pollutants, literally caught fire 13 times between 1868 and 1969. A river on fire. And the communities living nearest to the mines and factories, invariably the poorest communities, bore the heaviest burden of this pollution while receiving the smallest share of the profits. A pattern that, as we'll see, persists with disturbing precision to this day. Here's a dimension of the coal story that rarely makes the highlight reel. The Industrial Revolution didn't happen in a vacuum. It happened inside an empire. The wealth that funded Bolton and Watts factories, that built the railways, that capitalized the banks backing industrial expansion, significant portions of it flowed from enslaved labor in the Caribbean and the Americas, and from the systematic extraction of resources from colonized territories in Asia, Africa, and the Americas. The cotton that fed the textile mills of Manchester was picked by enslaved people in the American South. When slavery ended in British territories in 1833, the British government compensated not the enslaved people, but the slave holders, to the tune of £20 million, roughly 40% of the national budget. A debt so large that British taxpayers were still paying it off until 2015. Colonial railways were built across India, Africa, and South America, not primarily to develop those regions, but to extract their resources more efficiently. Raw materials flowed out, manufactured goods flowed in, often destroying local industries in the process. The steam engine was as much a tool of extraction as it was of production. India, which had been one of the world's largest textile economies before British colonization, had its domestic manufacturing systematically dismantled as cheap machine-made British cloth flooded its markets. The Industrial Revolution was a revolution, but it was a revolution with chosen beneficiaries, and the choosing was neither random nor fair.
For most of the 19th century, the idea that burning coal could alter the atmosphere would have seemed absurd. The atmosphere was vast, infinite practically. How could humans affect something so enormous? Then the science started catching up. In 1856, Eunice Newton Foote, an American scientist and women's rights activist, published findings showing that CO2 absorbs heat more efficiently than regular air. Her paper, presented at the American Association for the Advancement of Science, was the first recorded scientific observation of what we now call the greenhouse effect. 3 years later, Irish physicist John Tyndall independently confirmed the finding with more detailed experiments. Then, in 1896, Swedish chemist Svante Arrhenius did the math that nobody wanted to do. He calculated that doubling the concentration of CO2 in the atmosphere would raise global temperatures by approximately 5 to 6 degrees Celsius. He was working with slide rules and handwritten tables. His estimate, made in 1896, is remarkably close to modern climate models. The science was there. The warning was there. And for almost a century, it was largely ignored, because the people most positioned to act were also the people most financially invested in doing nothing. In the 1950s and 60s, scientists at Humble Oil, which later became ExxonMobil, were conducting their own internal research on climate change. Their findings mirrored the scientific consensus. Fossil fuel burning was warming the planet. Their response? Funded decades-long public relations campaign to cast doubt on that very science. It is one of the most consequential and deliberate acts of misinformation in human history, and its effects are still rippling through our political systems today. Here's the thing that gets lost in the drama of pollution and empire and injustice. The steam engine worked, not just as a historical curiosity, as a template. Every power generation system you use today is, at its core, doing the same thing James Watt's engine did in 1769, using heat to create pressure to spin something. Your coal power plant? Steam turbine. Your natural gas plant? Steam turbine. Your nuclear reactor? Steam turbine. We built a civilization on the principle of boil water, spin a wheel, and we've never really left. Even solar thermal plants, which use mirrors to focus sunlight, ultimately boil water to spin turbines. The steam engine didn't just power the 19th century, it established the architecture of energy generation that we still largely live inside. The irony is sharp. We are still, in the most literal engineering sense, children of Watt's invention. The turbine in a modern wind farm is a direct philosophical descendant of the sun and planet gear Watt designed in 1781 to convert reciprocal motion to rotation. We changed the fuel. We haven't changed the machine.
So where does this story go? If the steam engine represents humanity's Energy Act 1, raw, brilliant, world-changing, catastrophically costly, what does Act 2 look like? There are several competing visions. All of them are, in different ways, conversations with Watt's legacy. Hydrogen. Hydrogen fuel cells generate electricity through chemistry, not combustion. No CO2, no particulate matter. The exhaust is water vapor. Proponents argue it could replace natural gas in industry, power shipping and aviation, sectors where batteries are simply too heavy, and provide clean backup power for renewable grids. The challenge? Hydrogen is extraordinarily energy-intensive to produce cleanly. Right now, over 95% of global hydrogen is produced from fossil fuels. Green hydrogen, made using renewable electricity, is technologically proven, but economically nascent. Nuclear fusion. Fusion, the process powering the sun, has been 20 years away for approximately 70 years. But something shifted recently. In December 2022, the National Ignition Facility at Lawrence Livermore Laboratory achieved fusion ignition for the first time. More energy out than laser energy in. It's early, enormously early. The gap between that experiment and a commercial fusion power plant is still measured in decades and billions of dollars. But for the first time in 70 years, the physics is confirmed. It works. Now it's an engineering problem. And humans, as we've established, are very good at engineering. Distributed solar. The price of solar panels has fallen by over 90% since 2010. In much of the world, solar is now the cheapest form of electricity ever measured in human history. The implications are profound. The steam engine centralized power, physically and economically. Energy meant massive infrastructure, massive capital, massive corporations. Coal required railways and ports and industrial complexes. Solar, in its ideal form, is the opposite. A rooftop panel in rural Nigeria generates real electricity without a grid, without a utility company, without a century of built infrastructure. Energy could, for the first time in human history, become genuinely decentralized. The political and economic implications of that shift are staggering and largely unwritten. Let's go back to that workshop in Glasgow, 1765. James Watt is staring at a broken machine. He doesn't know what he's about to do. He doesn't know that within a century, his idea will have reshaped every continent on Earth. He doesn't know about the mines, or the children, or the smog. He doesn't know about CO2 accumulating in an atmosphere that has never, in all its billions of years, experienced anything quite like what he's about to unleash. He just sees a machine that wastes energy, and he thinks, there must be a better way. That impulse, the conviction that the current arrangement is not good enough, that efficiency is possible, that problems exist to be solved, that impulse is genuinely one of the most powerful forces in human history. It built the modern world. It also burned it. And the lesson sitting inside that paradox is one we are still desperately trying to learn. Every transformative technology carries within it both its promise and its peril. The steam engine promised power and delivered it. It also promised progress and delivered it. But it never promised wisdom, and wisdom, it turns out, is the one thing you cannot engineer. The coal age is not over. Globally, coal still generates roughly 36% of the world's electricity. Over 1 billion people still burn solid fuels for cooking and heating. The transition is happening. Renewable energy is the fastest growing energy source in human history, but it is happening against a backdrop of atmospheric CO2 that is still rising, still compounding, still collecting a debt that was first run up in the steam-filled cities of the 1820s. Watt died in 1819, wealthy and celebrated. The world he made was, by the standards of his time, extraordinary, faster, richer, more connected than any human civilization in history. He never saw the bill. We are the ones holding it.
The steam engine is not a villain. It is not a hero. It is something more uncomfortable than either. It is a mirror. A mirror that shows us what humans do when we discover power. We use it, brilliantly and recklessly, and we let the costs fall on whoever is least equipped to resist them. We tell stories of progress that are true and incomplete. We build futures that are genuinely better for some people and brutally worse for others. And then, eventually, if we're lucky, if we're paying attention, we reckon with it. The question hanging over this century is whether we'll reckon with the carbon legacy of the coal age in time to prevent the worst of what's coming, or whether, 200 years from now, someone will be making a video about us, about how we knew and what we chose. The workshop is still open. The machine is still running. What we do next is up to us.